Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Good evening, folks who are joining us on Zoom. Do check in if you're not hearing us or we need more audio or anything like that. We're glad to have you here. I'm Melanie Armstrong. I am the director of the Ruckelshaus Institute here at the University of Wyoming. I just started in this role in January, so I'm excited as I get to know more about the university. I get to know more of you and get to know more of the people that we work with through the Ruckelshaus Institute. Really excited to meet Bob Dreer and to have the chance to introduce him tonight as our inaugural visiting senior conservation fellow with the Ruckelshaus Institute. And really excited. I actually had been hired when I first heard about Bob coming and filling in this role, and just felt like it was a brilliant idea. So thanks to those who made this happen and made the connection and brought Bob's expertise as well as his excitement to participate in a variety of roles through the visiting fellow, visiting classes, advising faculty, working with us on projects, all great things. And I think just really a great asset for the Ruckelshaus Institute, for the Haupt School, and for the university and our community here. So I'm going to briefly introduce Bob and then turn it over to him for our talk tonight. So, gosh, there's a lot to say. Really, he said not to say it. So I'll be brief. We'll say he has a long career with a lot of depth of expertise in fields ranging from wildlife to water to federal land management to other natural resource topics. Has worked for a number of different agencies and organizations, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the EPA, the Department of Justice, and Defenders of Wildlife, just to give a range of some of those. Has worked with, from the legal side of things, worked on courts and policy making, and ways to assist with decision making around natural resource topics, obviously a topic of keen interest to the Ruckelshaus Institute and those of us who work within that. But then also later on in his career worked on really thinking about how to develop lasting solutions to conservation issues, and how broad engagement with stakeholders could be used to bring that about. Is that fair? He has a prestigious background with degrees from Harvard, Brown, and his JD from Yale University, and lots of other experience. And I'm just really excited to get to know him during his visit here and his talk tonight, titled The Importance of Collaboration and Interdisciplinarity, Insights on How to Address Current and Future Natural Resource Issues. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Bob Dreer.
All right, so I'm going to see how this works. And you guys can tell me if it's working. Okay, hear that? All right, excellent. This is all new to me here. I may have held a lot of jobs, but I've never was a television host or. All right, so I first want to thank the Haupt School and the Ruckelshaus Institute for bringing me out here. I mean, it's really been a pretty wonderful experience for me at this point in my career to engage with so many wonderful and committed and smart and interesting people that want to work in the field that I care deeply about, of natural resources. And so it's been a real pleasure. And I hope I can offer some practical insight to help guide people, because I think that's the point of this visiting fellow position. I've been thinking about what I could say in a forward-looking public-facing speech, or whatever this is supposed to be, public-facing speaking engagement. I'm not a scholar, and there are people on your faculty here who have thought more deeply and with more discipline about issues involving conservation and collaboration than I have. But I thought I could offer some perspectives from the more than 40 years I've spent working in the field of conservation and environmental law. And in that time, as you just heard, I've had a chance to work really on all sides of the table. And there's always more than two sides to the table, or usually. I've worked in private practice, representing clients and counseling them on environmental issues. I've worked in government for 3 different agencies with very different agency cultures and very different senses of mission, but with a common sort of engagement on environmental issues, the EPA, the Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I spent, the rest of my time representing nonprofits, environmental groups in litigation, working for Earth Justice for more than 10 years, and working for the Defenders of Wildlife for about 8.5 or so. And am now semi-retired, but I'm finding I'm mostly unretired. I'm working 2/3 time for the Potomac River Keeper as their legal director. I'm working 1/3 time for somebody else, and I'm working 1/4 time. It's so you get the picture. I was not ready to quit, it turns out. And there was just too much stuff going on that looked interesting. So anyway, so I thought I'd offer some thoughts tonight, drawn from all that experience, if it's of any value, that on 2 issues that I think are deeply connected. One is how to find common ground in disputed environmental issues, where the issues are pretty hot. And a lot of my early career, half of my early career was spent in bringing environmental litigation and forcing people into uncomfortable situations against their will, because that was my role. I was usually a plaintiff's lawyer. So I have some experience in that aspect of environmental disputes, where things get hot enough that you actually end up in court. And I want to talk a little bit about the importance of finding common ground in that setting. And then I want to reflect a little from that experience on the importance of collaboration in addressing the 2 really overarching challenges that we face today in conservation: climate change and biodiversity loss. And I will warn you, there will be war stories. What did you expect? I'm a lawyer. So, and unfortunately, some of you have heard many of the best war stories already. I've tried to hold back some of the punchlines from some of them, but I apologize. You'll have heard some of this. Anyway, so I said my background was in environmental litigation, and using the courts to enforce environmental laws against polluters, or to challenge government actions that don't fulfill statutory mandates for the protection of natural resources like public lands or endangered species. And that may sound like the opposite of collaboration, because it uses the machinery of the law to force people to change their behavior. And there certainly is truth to that. A court injunction is a pretty powerful constraint on people's conduct. Some cases it can effectively end a dispute. That's particularly true if it's a project or an action which is only weakly supported. If it is marginal economically, the transaction costs of being sued by an environmental group can end a project. But I found over and over in my career that where the environmental disputes reflect deeply felt interests on both sides, powerful economic interests, deep senses of landowner identity, pitted against strongly held preservationist views, that lasting resolution of the dispute may need to go outside the courtroom. A court decision can clarify the legal requirements that a project must meet. It can ensure consideration for environmental values and mitigation for environmental impacts. But relatively few of our environmental laws give absolute answers. It's pretty hard to use a law to get a judge to tell a government agency or a private developer, you can't do this at all. And sometimes, that's the objective. Sometimes it's a badly thought through project from the point of view of the interests you represent. NEPA is a good example, the National Environmental Policy Act. I mean, you all know that it has been construed by the Supreme Court as requiring consideration of environmental impacts, but as not necessarily requiring wise decision-making. An agency can, the standard sort of joke in the environmental community is that, if the Defense Department decided to declare World War III and end life on Earth, they would need to do an EIS, but they could still do it, right? So NEPA is not the strongest tool in the tool shed. The Endangered Species Act is stronger, but even the Endangered Species Act has opportunities for maneuver that will allow a project, if it is strongly enough supported, to move forward. I once had the sort of the Pyrrhic victory of suing the Corps of Engineers over their decision to build a dam in West Virginia that they claimed was going to be a flood control dam. It was really part of Senator Byrd's efforts to bring more federal money into West Virginia. But they proposed this dam, and I sued them under NEPA, and I got a court decision that their EIS was defective and they remanded to the agency. And then like 2 years later, they fixed the EIS and they came back and they built the dam. And so, you know, if you want a lasting solution to a conflict, if you actually want something that will achieve some sort of resolution, you got to think about finding common ground. And of course, obviously, even the strongest court order can't stop Congress from intervening and overriding the law you're in. Most famously, you know, Sharon Bacino is here tonight, and she knows this history as well as I do because she's a public lands expert. But, you know, in the campaign to protect the Northwest forests, I was with Earth Justice, then called Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, but and I was not bringing these cases, but they were the leading cases we were bringing in the organization, representing environmental groups trying to protect the spotted owl, and with the purpose of trying to protect old growth forests in the Northwest. And we were winning in court, and winning enough that Congress passed a timber rider, a rider on an appropriations bill that declared that compliance with the new provisions in the timber rider constituted compliance for all purposes, for all statutes cited in the following cases. And then they listed our cases by name and docket number. So we thought that was kind of unfair. In fact, we thought it was a violation of separation of powers, and we took that to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court said, in their kind of, you know, they're up pretty high and they can see pretty far over the landscape. And they said, look, they get to set the laws to begin with. And so they can certainly amend the laws. And what they've done is de facto amended the National Forest Management Act and the Endangered Species Act so that compliance with these sets of provisions in this timber rider constitutes compliance with those statutes. And that's not telling the courts how they have to decide your case. That's telling the courts what the law is that they need to actually enforce and interpret. So we lost that case, and which, you know, is a lesson. You need to have more to work with than just smart lawyers that can make good arguments in court. And I've learned that to get this kind of lasting resolution, you know, you need to think beyond. I mean, I guess I should say first that I'm not in any way undercutting the importance of citizen suits and litigation to enforce the environmental laws. A lot of times it can change the power dynamic. It can be a powerful tool for bringing people to the table for the first time. I've had clients tell me in a local citizens group that they were unable to get the people in the government agency that they were dealing with to ever talk to them until I finally sued the government agency and appeared on their behalf. And suddenly they were able to get a meeting. And so you get this kind of power imbalance sometimes, and litigation can be very helpful in changing that power balance. And it can force, as I said, it can force agencies and project proponents to confront environmental issues and to actually think about mitigation. But you need to do more than that if you want to get a lasting resolution. And it also helps to understand, as I came to understand, that environmental disputes involve deep disputes often among people's values and interests. The people that were on the other side of these disputes were real people. They were agency officials who genuinely thought that their plans were the best way to carry out the agency's mission, sometimes deeply influenced by their sense of the agency's culture and its history. And they resented having outsiders try to tell them what to do. Developers, landowners, and communities that wanted to see economic progress and jobs. Companies that cared about their environmental record, even as they pursued profits. So I came to appreciate the need to establish relationships of mutual respect for people with differing interests, and particularly where they share the same community. If you're going to live with people in the same community for a long time, if you're a place-based organization, and I was not usually in that role, I was usually coming in as outside counsel for a local environmental group, but they had to live with the long-term relationships that they had to build, and trying to find common ground is essential if you want to try to move forward and have people you're going to work with for decades in communities. So I'll give you a couple of examples of places where I think it worked well, or at least it was you know, a good attempt. One is the work I did on the Penobscot River. I worked on the Penobscot River as part of a project to buy out a series of old power dams on the river that were blocking fish passage. And they were serious barriers to fish passage. I'd gotten involved, 8 years or so before that time, to litigate against, and was successful in stopping a proposed new dam that would have really killed the opportunities for fish passage. The Penobscot River in Maine is really the only hope for restoration of the Atlantic salmon, an endangered species in the United States. And these dams were a major impediment. I mean, to give you a sense of what's going on, even with state-of-the-art fish passage, each of these dams reduced the fish population getting over the dam by 10%. So if you had 3 major main stem dams like this, that you're reducing the fish that even get up to the headwaters by 30%. And then they take a toll coming back down. They can take 10% at each dam for fish that pass through the turbines. So, for fish, particularly fish that are on their last legs, like the Atlantic salmon, figuratively speaking, fish don't actually have legs. I was in front of the Maine Board of Environmental Protection, which is a citizen board, which is the highest environmental agency in Maine. And the chairman of the board was a veterinarian. And at one point, memorably, he convened the hearing and he said, well, you're talking about how do you count fish? And he said, all I know about counting is you count the number of legs and you divide by 4. And so everybody said, okay, and moved on. That was a good joke. I lost in front of him, but did ultimately win in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the first time they'd ever denied a license to a power dam, in part because the ecological damage of this additional dam was just going to be so extreme in terms of ending the opportunity for fish restoration. So then I came back at the request of my clients in that case, who included the Penobscot Indian Nation and the Maine Natural Resources Council, the major environmental group in Maine, and a series of national groups. Also included the Atlantic Salmon Federation of Fishermen. So came back on behalf of this coalition with a really concerted effort to buy out the remaining dams in the main stem that were such a barrier. And so we went to the power companies that owned the dams. That was one power company that owned these dams. And we said, we want to buy them from you and we're willing to pay you market price. And they were not initially very happy to talk to us, but we said, let's hire an appraiser together and let's find out how much they're worth. And then when you get a value, you would sell these dams for that money, presumably to another power company. So we want you to sell them to us. And they said, are you going to be able to raise the money for this? And we said, yep, we'll raise the money for it. So we did that and we agreed on a market price. They would not, there was no chance at that point. We had tried to use the courts. We tried to use the regulatory process to force the relinquishment or the conditioning of their licenses. We had gotten nowhere with using the regulatory forces. So the only way to get these dams out was to do the old fashioned way, was to buy them out. So we offered them market value and we then went to, or as part of the process, we went to the state and asked for their support for this effort, said it would be a great effort to restore the fishery and the fish populations in the Penobscot River, and everybody in Maine would love it. And they said, great, you've got to make us whole. You've got to replace all the electric power that's lost, even though these dams are old and they only generate a token amount of electric power. So it's renewable energy. And so we had to find opportunities to expand renewable energy generation on dams elsewhere in the watershed. And we had to agree to not only support, but we had to agree not to oppose these things when the power company went before FERC. And that's not so bad because you can put new turbines in existing turbine houses and not cause a lot of environmental damage and generate more power. So we did that. So that was the price tag for going forward. We had to pay full value and we had to replace the power. And then we got the support of the federal delegation. We got money from Congress. We did a fundraising operation where the groups shared they wouldn't share their donors with each other, but they very diligently pursued their donors. We raised the money to take the dams out. And then we ran into the unexpected barrier, which was the Secretary of State of Maine. Some of you have heard this story, and I'm sorry, but it's so entertaining. So that to take the dams out, we had to create a nonprofit corporation in Maine that would own the dams and that would have the authority to then deconstruct them. And so we set up a nonprofit corporation and applied for a certificate of incorporation. And we were told by the Secretary of State that it was against Maine public policy to create a corporation with the purpose of destroying a useful asset. And so we said, well, these aren't really useful assets. And they said they generate electricity. And we said, well, it's going to be great for the people of Maine because we're restoring a river. And they said, well, that's not a purpose that we recognize. It took us 6 months, but we finally got a corporation approved by the state of Maine. And we were able to take it down. So there's an example where we had to deal with all of the stakeholders. The stakeholders included the federal delegation that wanted reassurances. It included the state that wanted us to make sure we found ways to replace the power. We had to come up with the money. We had to deal with internal conflicts within the groups because all of them were kind of suspicious of each other. But it succeeded. And if you go back there, as I've done, you can hardly see where the dams were, and the rivers are full of fish. Another dispute where I think how you reach common ground together is at least interesting is a dispute in Scranton, Pennsylvania over the development of a pristine mountain ridge there called Moosic Mountain. The Scranton Chamber of Commerce proposed to build a business park there, and it was connected to a sort of a fly-by-night proposal to build a federal prison there, and it was on this pristine habitat that was very rare dwarf oak and scrub pine habitat that was really only found in Pennsylvania on that ridgetop and not found elsewhere except up in Canada. So it was quite rare. And the local citizens group that hired me wanted to fight this. So I sued over it under NEPA because they had done no NEPA analysis to speak of, even though there was federal funding involved. That's the hook. And we went into mediation together. And it was, at least at the time, was the first mediated settlement discussion under NEPA. We worked with a group, mediation group called Resolve, which is kind of famous for mediation work. And we did everything right. We signed confidentiality agreements. We met together for days and days and days, spread out over a space of a few weeks, several weeks, a month, 6 weeks of my driving up to Scranton and meeting with people in a closed conference room. And I was there with my group's president and me representing them, and the head of the Chamber of Commerce and several representatives of the Chamber of Commerce and the lawyer for the federal government. And we talked about the concerns that my clients had with protecting this rare habitat. We took a field trip up to the mountain and walked the habitat with biologists. And all of this was confidential. And at the end of and they'd already started some construction, they'd already carved roads into it and cleared plots for buildings. At the end of it, the Chamber of Commerce said, we get it, this is really a special place. And we will propose to buy the rest of the mountaintop, which goes on for another like 3 miles. We'll buy the whole mountaintop and put it in a preserve. And the preserve will be managed by the Nature Conservancy or some other group permanently. And it'll preserve all of the undisturbed habitat that remains, because the one area where we're trying to build a business park got pretty badly disturbed before the lawsuit. And we said, okay, that was a good faith way of trying to actually save this mountain. And here's where the punchline, some of you heard the story, but didn't hear that I said, this is where I get fired. So what we had done is we'd agreed to a confidentiality agreement. So the president of my citizens group and I were the only 2 people on the plaintiff's side who knew about these negotiations, who understood that in the course of weeks of negotiations spent in a room with each other, we had built personal kind of bonds with each other. I mean, maybe it was the Stockholm syndrome, but we had really come to trust the people from the Chamber of Commerce, and they had come to respect what we were trying to protect, enough so that they offered this really far-ranging and expensive conservation solution. And when we came out of the room finally and were authorized for the first time to go talk to our membership, they were outraged. They wanted to kill this thing dead. They didn't want, they wouldn't accept half a compromise. They wouldn't accept part of the mountain. They want the whole thing. So they fired me as their lawyer, and they fired their president, and they went ahead and pursued the lawsuit with another lawyer that they found, and they lost, hands down. And which sounds like a bad outcome, right? And here's sort of the point of the story. Even though they lost, the Scranton Chamber of Commerce went ahead and bought the mountain and put it into a preserve. And it's now there today as a fully protected preserve for this habitat, managed by the Nature Conservancy. And they did it because they'd had a conversion experience in the room with us about what the importance was of this habitat, and they thought it was the right thing to do. Now, go figure. You know, I mean, I got fired, we lost the case, and they still did what they offered to do to settle the case. That's pretty unusual, but it would not have happened without the time we spent together and the sense of trust we'd built with each other as representatives in all of those meetings. Anyway, I'll tell one more, and then I'll move on. But this is the time when I worked on a proposed resort development on the coastline of St. Croix down in the Virgin Islands. It was on a pristine area of St. Croix called Salt River Bay, which was just a beautiful coastal bay with mangrove forests and deep mountain slopes coming down to the bay, and a lot of architectural history, well-preserved Caribbean ball courts and villages on the site. It was a national natural landmark and a national historic landmark. It was the first place Columbus landed in the United States territory. So and of course, being Columbus, it's where he kidnapped women and children from the village and took them back to Spain as slaves. So can you hear me now? All right, let me just shift to this and that'll do fine. So this developer was proposing to build just a coastal resort there. His response to the concerns about preservation and about archaeological significance were pretty dismissive. He said he was going to have an archaeologist on staff who would be there as a resource, and the visitors to the resort could go out and work with them with trowels and explore the site and as part of the experience. Kind of like ecotourism, but not with a much of a base of archaeological expertise. And I sued to try to stop the thing. My clients at one point put themselves in front of bulldozers in order to try to stop the development, and I flew down the next day and got an emergency injunction. And we were able to stop the development. I got an emergency injunction in part because the judge that I drew was a extremely crusty, conservative, old judge, federal district judge from New Jersey, who was sitting by designation and drew my case. And turned out he hated the Virgin Islands government, which he viewed as corrupt, more than he disliked environmentalists. So I thought I was dead meat in front of him, but he gave them a very hard time and joined the project. And so that stalled the project. The developer lost his funding temporarily, but it didn't solve the problem because all he had to do was get funding and then take it up on appeal. And I was on the weakest of arguments legally. I was relying on the Coastal Zone Management Act, which declares that its purpose is to preserve and develop the coastal zone of the United States. So, go figure which part of the statute I was relying on. And so we needed to do something more. And we decided, this was my client's inspiration, but I thought it was great and I helped him do it. We hired an economist. We did an economic analysis of the benefits to the Virgin Islands economy of another beach resort being built at this site versus designation of the site as a national park. Nobody up until that time had ever mentioned the idea of a national park, but we just said, ask an economist what might mean for the Virgin Islands. And what he said was, the resorts were there were like 9 other resorts and they were operating under capacity. It would be almost no added value to build another resort. It would just siphon off the visitors from other resorts. But a destination of a national park would draw tens of thousands of new visitors every year to St. Croix with this big and a multi-million-dollar benefit. And we took that to the Virgin Islands government, which up until then had been entirely in the pocket of the developer. And we turned them around. And we ended up having them come strongly behind it. And the delegate from the Virgin Islands introduced a bill in Congress, and we actually got it passed. And it's now a national park. So, there's an example of where you think about the people that are involved in a dispute, and one of the things that may help is to think creatively about expanding the decision space. One option was just to fight them to the death and try to leave the site unimpaired. But, he had a property interest, which the Park Service then bought out when they went forward. He didn't have the money to do that. We had no way to really obtain that outcome unless we changed the whole discussion and said, let's make a national park here that will benefit everybody and we'll raise everybody's, rising tide raises everybody's boats. The other resort developers, not surprisingly, got behind it. They were all happy with it. They didn't like this developer either. So, anyway, it was everybody ended up winning except for that developer. I don't feel sorry. Anyway, so to move on, those are places where you have to think creatively and you have to identify stakeholder interests and try to find common ground. And I found similar lessons in government. I'm going on too long, so I'm going to try to move fast. It's really important, I found, in government to try to engage and respond to stakeholder concerns when you're taking regulatory action that affects strong public interests. I saw that early in my career in forest planning, where the George Washington National Forest proposed a huge increase in timber harvest, tripling the timber harvest and road building. And they got sued by me and held up for 10 years in finalizing their forest plan. I had to cut that way back. But the neighboring national forest in West Virginia, the Monongahela National Forest, had spent a year and a half of outreach with all of the stakeholder groups, with bow hunters, with all of the hunting groups, with the Sierra Club, with all of the environmental groups, with all the outdoor recreation people, and said, where are the places on this forest you care about? And then they developed a plan that increased timber harvest on the forest, but protected all of the special areas that conservationists and recreationists and hunters cared about. And they didn't even get appealed. So, if you take the effort to reach out to people and try to engage and meet their interests, you can have much more success in pushing forward a difficult government decision, I think. And so I took that to heart when I had the chance to be in government in a couple of different instances. I'm just going to gloss over them very quickly. I worked in one instance with the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a new permitting program. It would be the first new major environmental permitting program in 40 years for migratory birds under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And I wanted to get out of the model of individual permits and painstaking site reviews and long monitoring, because my own agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service, had no staff to commit to this. They had no money and no staff. They wanted to do it, but they couldn't actually spend the time to do real nitpicky site reviews. And the good news was that we had all industry sectors that had sort of the same kinds of effects on migratory birds, and that could use technologies and best management practices that everybody understood. They weren't using them, but they could. So for example, cell towers, all you really need to do to cut the mortality from birds running into cell towers at night is to use blinking strobe lights. Birds are attracted to steady burning lights and they'll hit them, but blinking lights, it's pretty darn good. It still gets some mortality, but it's a huge difference. So we proposed sort of a modern sort of 21st century idea for an environmental permit, which was a general permit covering a whole industry that you could sign up for online. And all you had to agree to do was to adopt industry standard methods of mitigation that we would define in the general permit. And pay a conservation fee, which would go into a fund that would protect bird habitat. It was kind of bold thinking. We did a lot of outreach to the affected community, a lot of meetings with wind power people, a lot of meetings with oil and gas. It had a long tail to the issue because the Trump administration came into power and reversed the legal interpretation that the act even applied to industry. And then that lost in court, and this administration, the Biden administration, is now moving forward again with a proposed rule. But it's an effort to sort of think about how you can make things as easy as possible for a regulated industry, to encourage them to comply and listen to them about what works. A whole lot of what we did was hold stakeholder meetings with industry to say, what do you know that works? And then we'd say, what does it cost? Can you afford it? And then we'd say, that's what we'll put in the rule. I think, and I'll mention just one other thing. I think maybe the most meaningful work I've ever done in my career was the effort that we undertook to settle tribal trust cases. We had more than 80 tribes that had sued the United States in cases that have been pending in some cases for 20 years or more over breaches of trust in the management of their funding and in the management of their natural resources. You all know that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has authority as the trustee for Indian tribes to manage their funds and to manage their natural resources, and had not always done the best job. In some cases, it was pretty abysmal. There were instances where tribal funds were held without interest for 2 decades, without interest. So, our goal was first to try to find a fair and just resolution of these claims. That was our mission at the Justice Department. Litigate them if necessary, but try to find a fair and just resolution, and try to build a relationship of trust with the tribes who were suing us for breach of trust and had intense suspicion of the United States as the federal government. Try to build a relationship of trust with the tribes that would allow us to come together to identify what the right settlements would be. We built a very complicated econometric model of each tribe, of their natural resources, everything they had on the reservation that could have led to income, and of the way their funds were managed. We had forensic accountants that reconstructed the history of all of this and determined what a reasonable trustee would have done instead. And we came up with dollar amounts, and we went to the tribes. First, we engaged them on the methodology, explained everything we were trying to do, took their input on what factors we ought to include, and got their grudging kind of respect for the fact that this would be a fair attempt to come up with an approximation of their losses. And then we met with them one-on-one, spent a lot of time in front of tribal councils, listening to them. That's the first thing you do, is you listen to them, sometimes for a whole day, while they tell you all the things that the federal government has done wrong to them over a long period of time. And then, you tell them you honor and respect their grievances and their sense of loss, their sense of betrayal, and that there are only some of these things you can address. I mean, I had tribes ask me to return the Black Hills, and I told them that I couldn't do that. I said, but what I can do is try to make you whole for financial losses that you've suffered, and I'm here to try to do that. And then we would finally talk about that, and it ended up working. They trusted us enough to trust our model, and 76 tribes settled those cases with us for about $2.5 billion total, which was money, enormously well-deserved and very important in those tribal economies. And I feel really good about that. But there was a real challenge to know how to proceed respectfully with people who had been deeply harmed and who viewed you as someone alien to their culture, and to try to win their trust sitting in front of them just by being sincere and just by listening. So anyway, I'm going to move ahead to, I sort of drew some lessons from all this. Nothing I think that anyone here will find profound or original, but I earned them through making my own mistakes. So here's what I have to offer. You respect the people on the other side of the table. You identify and validate their interests. You recognize that people's interests in disputes over lands, wildlife, clean air, and clean water can be deeply personal or even spiritual. You find where you and your opponents share common values. Ranchers and farmers care deeply about the environment. I've had a lot of ranchers stand with me and say what really angers them about environmentalists is that they think that they don't care about the environment. And they say, I've lived here and my family has lived here for generations, and they think we don't care about the environment. So find that common ground. And then ask yourself if there are ways to address their concerns and their interests. Are there ways to find a solution that isn't a winner take all? Are there ways to enlarge the decision space like we did in the Virgin Islands? Find an accommodation that actually makes things better for most of the people involved. If you're in government, it's just some of the same. Communicate, engage with the stakeholders, be inclusive, listen to what they say. Fair decision making means a lot. I once had a chance to give a keynote address in front of an audience full of military environmental base commanders, and my theme was the rule of law. And I was filling in for my friend Dinah Baer, who was the general counsel of CEQ and had been asked to do this, not me. And then she was unable to do it. So I showed up with this theme of rule of law. And one of the things that I talked about in the sort of the feverish 2 days I had to do some research on this and think about what do I say in front of a room full of colonels and a few generals, is that a huge part of the rule of law is respect for the individual in the decision process. And that there's all this social science research that shows that people will accept, sometimes unhappily, but still accept as legitimate government decisions if they think the process of decision making has been fair and if they think they've had a fair chance to be heard. But what they hate is when they feel like they've been excluded and they feel like they've been unfairly treated. That stirs resentment that's deep enough to trigger litigation. It's deep enough to trigger protests. And so, I was just urging these base commanders to reach out to the stakeholders around the bases, engage the public, make sure they felt included in their decisions, and that it wouldn't guarantee they wouldn't get controversy, but it would help a lot. It would at least establish a relationship of good faith with the people that were around them. And I think we're going to need all of these kinds of interpersonal tools to try to address these two great challenges I mentioned: climate change and biodiversity loss. Climate change, it's changing the landscape in which we work. It's changing the whole landscape for wildlife conservation. It's a major threat to the survival of species. So it's a major new challenge to our commitment to sustain and recover imperiled species. And the response to climate change is going to kind of transform the landscape. The best economic analyses I've seen of the Inflation Reduction Act's federal subsidies for renewable energy is that it could lead to the quadrupling of the infrastructure for wind power and solar power in the next decade. They actually said in the next 8 years. And think about the massive infrastructure build out that would entail, including power lines, new transmission lines to get to places like this that have a lot of wind. I've experienced that firsthand, and a fair amount of sun. So there's going to be big changes from the impact of climate change on ecosystems and from the impact of our effort to adapt to it and to deal with it. And those are things that we need to be able to work collaboratively about. And one of the things I want to mention is a program that I was really proud of that involved 4 major environmental groups: the Nature Conservancy, NRDC, the Wilderness Society, and Defenders of Wildlife. That's called Smart from the Start. And what we did was we worked very consciously with the renewable energy companies to tell them that if they would work with us to site their proposed facilities in places that were low conflict areas that did not involve habitat for desert tortoises or other endangered species, that we would then support their efforts. We would work within the environmental community to explain and support and to try to persuade people not to challenge these projects, and that we would support the industries when they claimed that they were truly being environmental, that they were being green. And they bought it. It was enormously beneficial from their point of view because reducing the level of controversy of a major project can increase their ability to build it by years and can reduce the cost of projects significantly. And it really pretty much worked. There were very few lawsuits brought by the environmental groups against renewable energy projects, except in a few instances where they were put in really bad locations. So that's an example of collaboration. Environmental groups working with the renewable energy groups and working with the federal agencies. I mean, a lot of this was to work with BLM to get BLM to zone its lands for solar power and for wind power. And they did that in the California desert very effectively. And they still doubled the amount of land conserved under permanent conservation in the California desert, even as they carved out other lands that could fairly be developed in this manner without serious ecological harm. So, that's, I think, an example of how we need to collaborate. I think biodiversity loss, and it's larger than climate change. Some of you have heard my mantra on this, and I don't want to get all gloom and doom, but we've got up to 1 million species that face the threat of extinction in coming decades, about 1 in 8. And it's not just, of course, climate change. It's mostly human development. It's mostly habitat destruction, and more than anything else, it's cattle. The destruction of natural habitat in areas like the Congo and areas like the Amazon for cattle ranching is driving, and of course the cattle are providing beef for McDonald's, and it's having a huge impact on biodiversity. And just a small factoid just to give you a sense of where things have finally gotten. I just read a new report that came out just earlier this week, or about a week ago, that concluded that the total biomass of all wildland mammals on Earth was 10% of the weight of human beings. And that the weight of our dogs is equivalent to the weight of all wild animals on Earth. And these are land mammals, or didn't count the whales, but add up all the elephants, add up all the elk, add up all the species, game species you guys care about, add up all of that, it's the weight of our dogs. And when you throw in pigs are like 3 times the weight of all wild mammals left in the world. So we've got a lot of work to do if we want to actually try to protect natural ecosystems and to leave the planet recognizable for our children and grandchildren. And the good news is I think we have some tools that work. And I also think people are coming together to do that work. One tool that I will stand up and unabashedly defend is the Endangered Species Act. It's controversial. People, are constantly trying to undercut it in Congress. But it's actually remarkably successful given how little we've invested in it. 95% of listed species have survived to the present day. Some folks say 99%, but I think honestly there are some species that have quietly gone extinct and people haven't been able to find them in the wild, that haven't counted them, they haven't declared extinct yet. In any event, 95% is not bad considering that we've only funded the act with about a quarter of the funding that actually working for recovery of these species would require. And we're not spending much money. I mean, we're spending only a small fraction of $1 billion a year that we need under the Endangered Species Act, and $1 billion a year isn't that much. That leads me to the next point, which is that funding. Is there a chance we could radically change the equation for funding? We've got a bill in Congress that I would love to see passed called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That would provide $1.4 billion a year for state wildlife agencies to spend on species of conservation need, including endangered species. And there's a specific earmark for spending on endangered species. That would just transform wildlife conservation in this country. It's got challenges, but it would be a huge change for the better. And on that point, let me say one of the things we have going for us is that wildlife conservation is not yet poisoned by the political divisiveness in this country. It's getting there, but it is still considered to be a nonpartisan issue. There still are many Republican congressmen and senators who support wildlife conservation and don't see it as a quote environmental issue, but see it as an issue of protection of habitat. They'll go for that. They belong to Republican congressmen and senators belong to the International Conservation Caucus Foundation. They support international efforts to stop wildlife trafficking. We've got a chance in this field, unlike some of the other environmental areas where it's really polarized. We've got a chance in this field to bring people together to work for conservation. And that's hugely important for all of you guys for your futures, I think, because this doesn't have to be an area where everything just stays stalemated. And collaboration is at the heart of all of this. I mean, you all know wildlife don't honor boundaries. They don't see the lines on the map. And you can't talk about landscape level conservation without talking about transboundary efforts to bring people from different jurisdictions and different authorities together and try to figure out how to manage coherently at the landscape level. We had early signs of this in the state wildlife action plans. Some of the states were really proactive in reaching out to their neighboring states and collaboratively planning for species and habitat that cross state lines. We have the landscape level cooperatives under the Obama administration, discontinued for the large part under the Trump administration, but they still set sort of a precedent for how you can work collaboratively. We had the effort for the sage grouse, in which Wyoming and the other states that provide habitat for the sage grouse were at the absolute forefront of conservation. And it was a huge and important collaborative effort. It led to the amendment of all the BLM plans that had in states that had sage grouse. That in itself was an enormous undertaking because BLM is not a bureaucracy that responds immediately to direction from Washington. So it was a big effort for BLM to transform its management of these lands. And they did it with very close collaboration with the states. And Wyoming had the most progressive and the earliest efforts to conserve sage grouse, and it's still the most important sage grouse habitat. It's not over. Sage grouse are still, I think, in trouble, but they are the effort to conserve them was one that brought people together from all across the spectrum. Some of them people who viewed it mostly as a way to avoid the costs of what would happen if it was listed. They weren't necessarily genuinely concerned about the well-being of the sage grouse, but a lot of people viewed the sage grouse as part of our natural heritage. And that was clearly the responses we were getting from state governments. So anyway, I have a lot of encouragement from watching that happen at that level. I have encouragement from watching coexistence efforts seeing ranchers in the Tom Minor Basin, talk to other ranchers about making room for bears and wolves, learning how to manage their cattle so that they are largely protected from predation by bears and wolves, but absorbing the fact that they have predators in the landscape again. That's a dialogue that is just decades ahead of where we were just a while ago, and led by ranchers. To work effectively, we have to have something stronger. I think we need to have a comprehensive national approach. We need to have groups have called for a national biodiversity strategy that would start a dialogue between the states, between counties and local governments, between private landowners, between all the federal agencies, including importantly, the Department of Agriculture, which is the biggest conservation funder in the government, and the federal land management agencies, to develop a coherent strategy to protect species and biodiversity from loss. And with that, I think we could find out how we could work together to do it. And I think we could do it. I'm also seeing at the international level, countries all across the globe are working together to conserve biodiversity under the auspices of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we are the only country on earth not to have joined. We signed it, but the Senate has never brought it to the floor for a vote because they evidently believe that treaties interfere with US sovereignty. So that leaves us out of the picture for an incredibly important discussion on international conservation of global diversity, biodiversity. But I'm hopeful actually that we can try to turn that around. I'm part of an effort to try to reinitiate the ratification process for the treaty that would be led by faith-based groups and be led by wildlife conservation groups, and which would not be characterized as an environmental issue, but characterized as a stewardship issue, as an issue of our commitment to the rest of the planet. So, bottom line, these are daunting challenges. I don't think we're going to see pre-industrial levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or return to climate regimes that we think are normal for 100 years. We're going to have to deal with the changes and consequences of that problem. We'll unquestionably lose some species and their unknown contributions to the Earth's biodiversity. But I'm encouraged by the signs I see of people coming together to fight these issues. And I'm optimistic that we can, in fact, do a lot of good together. We can save not everything, but we can save many things. We can help wildlife and plants transition through new climate regimes. We can keep a large part of the Earth in natural condition to provide a home for life. And we can give our children and grandchildren lives that are graced with deep connections to nature, as ours are. And I think we can do all of that together. So thank you. I will take questions if people are still interested, but that was a long speech. I'm sorry. Sure.
So we've been talking about federal tribal collaborative management a lot in our advanced appellate advocacy class, and that's what we're kind of like focusing all of our briefs around is a potential issue in that space. How do you see federal tribal collaborative management helping kind of bring those agencies together and like maybe being part of a biodiversity initiative or like leading that charge?
That's a really good question. And, I really apologize. I did not mean to neglect the role of tribes in a national biodiversity discussion. They absolutely would be part of it. There are divided views in the traditional environmental community, particularly the environmental community that has spent so long trying to protect and build the wildlife refuge system and other federal land systems, about the notion of returning tribal lands to tribal management or returning species to tribal management. The National Bison Range is the clearest example. Congress passed legislation, as you know, you're probably all very familiar with it, but just a couple of years ago that returned management of the bison on that range, returned the lands of the range to the reservation for the Salish and Kootenai tribes, and charged them with management of the resource on terms that are similar to what they were managed under for the wildlife. In fact, first thing that they did was adopt the Fish and Wildlife Service refuge plan as their interim management plan. And they're committed to opening it up to public visitation. But it has returned the center of their refuge that was taken from them by the federal government by Teddy Roosevelt, returned it to the reservation. And I think it's really wonderful. I was working with the Fish and Wildlife Service when Dan Ash, my boss, called in chairman of the Confederated Salish Kootenai tribe and his members of his tribal council to meet with him in Washington. And they came in and they didn't know what the subject was. And when we told them, we wanted to work to turn the refuge back to them. And at first they didn't believe it. And the tribal chairman started to cry. He was like 80 years old. And he said, "This is the first time I've ever been called to Washington for good news." And it was just felt like the right thing to do, but it has enormous implications. I mean, where does it extend to? And people know that we're all standing on ancestral tribal lands. There probably isn't a square foot of the United States that isn't at some relatively recent point in history ancestral tribal lands. Even the myth of wilderness. You guys know about the story about Ansel Adams photographing Yosemite National Park and these dramatic photos he was taking of primeval lands and all this kind of stuff. He had the US cavalry with him who moved the Indians who lived there out of the picture so he could get pictures of Yosemite without the Indians present. So we're all on tribal lands, and the issues of social and environmental justice for tribes are really important ones to engage with. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai are the best start you could ask for. They have a wonderful tribal management record for wildlife. They're really committed to this. And I think many tribes would share that perspective and would perform really admirably. And frankly, the record of the Fish and Wildlife Service's engagement with that tribe at the bison range was pretty sorry. There was a lot of distrust of the staff of the Fish and Wildlife Service of the Indians in the tribe. And Dan's way of cutting through that problem was to say it's time to turn it back over. But my boss at Division Wildlife, another former director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, really felt like this was a hole being cut in the wildlife refuge system, an important piece of biodiversity that the service should be protecting, that it was losing, and that it opened the door, particularly in the Trump administration, to the risk of other refuges and other federal lands being turned over. I do think that's a fair implication. The legislation specifically says it cannot be used as a precedent. So, how do you tell people that it isn't a precedent? You can't call it a precedent. Anyway, it is a precedent, and it is one that I think we need to explore in the course of the next, generation. How we manage to show justice to the tribes that have been so badly treated, and how we honor their commitment to wildlife conservation. So a long answer, but big question. It's one of the biggest ones in our field.
So I also have a question about collaborative management. So you talk about environmental groups collaborating with industry for renewables to kind of work with them and find less environmentally controlled ways that they could roll out renewables. And area I've kind of been doing some research on this semester is minerals need for renewables and the amount of mining that we have to do to be able to meet minerals.
Yeah.
And I guess, do you think that the permitting processes currently sufficiently encourage collaboration in a way that will have the similar outcomes that we saw with renewables? And if not, what changes we made to make sure that that collaboration happens and there's still sufficient environmental actions?
All right, so fortunately, I have the answer to all that, and I can and we can solve this problem right here tonight. It's a huge issue, right? The mining law and the mining leasing acts are a world unto themselves, and primarily focused on the development of mineral resources. The 1872 mining law is the last vestige of the era of land management that was basically, the federal lands were a treasure hunt. You go on them, you find something of value, and then you take it. It's yours. And it used to be the way that people treated federal lands across the board. They timber theft, everything. But now you can still go onto federal lands that are open to mining under the Mining Act and stake a claim. And then, if they find minerals, you can own the claim. So it's still like this weird, bizarre, 19th century concept of settlement across the West. And it was aimed at encouraging rapid settlement of the West. It does not have processes that are adequate for this. I think federal agencies involved will have to bend over backward to try to be inclusive. I know there's a current controversy, and I honestly don't remember the name of it, but there's a current controversy about a huge copper mine that is in an area that is sacred to local Indian tribes. And there will be those kinds of conflicts, spiritual conflicts with tribes, special areas that will be very difficult to resolve. So no, I don't think the process is adequate now, and I think it's going to take extraordinary resolve and sensitivity on the part of the federal agency managers involved and the other participants in the process to try to actually hear people's concerns and figure out ways to reconcile them. And the issue of climate change has skewed the scales on this. I don't know how Sharon feels about this, but for years I've been working for the issue of wildlife conservation and stopping biodiversity loss. And I've been treated by colleagues in the environmental community as if that was a second-tier issue and one that really was a distraction from fighting climate change. And that if there was a choice to be made between what you have to do to successfully stop climate change and if it was a butterfly that was in the way, well, we're sorry about the butterfly, that was really the attitude of a lot of the climate groups that were so, and they were, there was a reason why they were so energized. They viewed climate change as an existential threat to life on Earth, and it is. But you don't have to discard everybody else in the lifeboat, So I think figuring out how to do that on the landscape is going to be very difficult, much more difficult than what I described in the smart from the start process, because frankly, there are large tracts of federal lands that are suitable for wind power or solar energy that don't have high other resource values. But minerals are where they are, and a big mineral deposit is going to be, you can't move it. It's going to be a real source of conflict. So good question. Wish I had the answer. Anything else? You guys don't have homes to go to. You don't have, loved ones waiting for you. No dinner, no heavy drinking after this lecture. Well, anyway, thank you again for bringing me here and giving me a chance to be part of a community that cares this deeply about these issues. It really feels special. So thank you.
I get to talk.
You